Standing in the shadow of a colossal ancient monument, you might assume its builders commanded limitless resources. But what if that very monument was designed to trick your eyes? For centuries, empires have used architecture not just to impress, but to deceive, crafting illusions so convincing they've rewritten history itself. Picture a ruler who couldn't afford an army of thousands, so instead, they built a palace with cleverly angled walls to make a handful of soldiers appear like an endless legion. Or imagine a city skyline where every building was deliberately constructed to exaggerate its height, creating the illusion of unshakable dominance. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were deliberate lies in stone, meant to manipulate allies and intimidate rivals. Why would entire civilizations go to such lengths? Because perception has always been power. A kingdom might be crumbling from within, but if its temples looked indestructible, enemies would think twice before attacking. A pharaoh's treasury could be nearly empty, but gold-leafed ceilings and forced perspective could make visitors believe in boundless wealth. These architectural tricks weren't just vanity, they were survival strategies, propaganda carved into pillars and painted onto walls. And the most astonishing part, many of these illusions still work today. When we gaze at the ruins of ancient empires, we're often seeing exactly what those rulers wanted us to see, a version of their reign that's grander, richer, and more formidable than reality. So how did they pull it off? Over the next 24 revelations, we'll explore the hidden engineering behind history's greatest architectural cons. From hollow columns that echoed with false grandeur to staircases that seemed to climb endlessly into the heavens, these designs were masterclasses in psychological manipulation. You'll discover how sunlight was weaponized to create godlike auras around rulers, how gardens were laid out to seem infinite, and how even the placement of doorways could make visitors feel small and insignificant. This isn't just a tour of ancient sites, it's a detective story, unraveling the secrets that shaped our understanding of the past, ready to see history not as it was, but as it wanted to be remembered. Let's begin. Walk up to the base of the Parthenon today, and your eyes will tell you it's a perfect rectangle, but that's the first clue you're being deceived. Every single one of those gleaming white columns tilts slightly inward. The floor beneath your feet slopes at an angle you can't quite perceive, and the spacing between pillars narrows just enough to trick your brain. This wasn't shoddy construction, it was genius-level psychology in stone. The ancient Greeks knew that true power doesn't come from how big something actually is, but how big it feels. By bending reality with forced perspective, they turned an impressive temple into an awe-inspiring monument that seemed to touch the gods themselves, and they weren't alone. Over in Egypt, pharaohs used the same trick with even grander ambitions. The temples at Luxor and Karnak weren't just built on flat ground. They were constructed on rising platforms so that as you approached, each new courtyard sat higher than the last. Your legs would grow tired from climbing, your neck would crane upward, and by the time you reached the inner sanctum, your body had already been conditioned to feel small. The ceilings weren't just tall, they were angled to draw your gaze toward statues of the ruler, bathed in carefully placed shafts of sunlight to make them glow like deities. It was theater on a civilization-sized scale, where every step, every shadow, every column was a calculated part of the performance. But here's what's truly fascinating: these illusions still work. Modern measurements prove the Parthenon's columns vary in thickness by inches, yet no casual observer would ever notice. The human eye smooths over the imperfections, just as the architects intended. That's the real secret behind these ancient lies. They weren't meant to withstand scrutiny up close. They were designed for impact at a distance, for travelers seeing the skyline from miles away, for ambassadors approaching with gifts or threats, for ordinary citizens looking up and feeling the weight of something greater than themselves. In a world before cameras or drones, first impressions were everything, and these empires mastered the art of making sure that first impression was a carefully crafted exaggeration. The Romans didn't just build structures, they built illusions. Step up to one of their grand monuments, and the gleaming marble facade might convince you the entire thing was carved from the finest stone. But run your hand along the edge and you'd discover the truth. That polished surface was often just a thin sheet, glued over a core of cheap brick or even rubble. This was architecture as sleight of hand, where empires on a budget could still project unlimited wealth. Take the Colosseum, that iconic symbol of Roman power. Its towering outer arches weren't holding up the building, they were a carefully crafted mask. Behind those elegant curves, rough concrete and recycled materials, hidden in plain sight. Why go to such lengths? Because Rome understood that appearances could shape reality. A visiting diplomat wouldn't see the shortcuts, they'd see a flawless monument radiating prosperity. Citizens walking past those marble-clad temples wouldn't question their taxes. They'd feel pride in a civilization that seemed incapable of scarcity. Even enemies planning an invasion might hesitate, assuming a city that could afford such splendor must have reserves of gold and soldiers to match. It was propaganda in 3 dimensions, where every polished column whispered, "We are invincible." But the real stroke of genius was how these facades aged. While cheaper materials crumbled over centuries, the marble shells often remained intact, leaving later generations, including us, with ruins that still scream grandeur. Modern archaeologists have found entire Roman neighborhoods where only the decorative fronts survived, like a stage set after the play has ended. That's the ultimate testament to the illusion's success. Even time couldn't fully erase the lie. And Rome wasn't alone in this game. Across the ancient world, from Persia to Mesoamerica, rulers used similar tricks. The difference, the Romans industrialized the deception. They developed standardized marble veneers, prefabricated columns, and even painted finishes that mimicked rare stones, an entire economy built on making the ordinary look extraordinary. It wasn't just about hiding poverty, it was about manufacturing awe on an empire-wide scale. When your buildings could make 1 million people believe in your infinite power, that power became real. The lesson for us, next time you see ruins bathed in golden sunlight, remember, you might be staring at history's most enduring magic trick. Those flawless surfaces weren't just decoration. They were the ancient world's version of special effects, designed to make you see exactly what the empire wanted you to see. The Colossus of Rhodes wasn't just a statue, it was the ancient world's greatest bluff. Towering over the harbor, this bronze giant appeared to be a solid testament to the island's wealth and power. But get close enough and you'd hear the hollow echo of deception. The truth, this wonder of the world was more empty space than metal. Its imposing form just a thin skin stretched over a rickety skeleton of stone blocks and iron bars. Imagine standing beneath it, the sunlight would catch that polished bronze exterior, making it gleam like solid gold from miles away. Ships entering the harbor saw what looked like an indestructible monument forged from endless resources. But the reality was far more clever. That hollow core wasn't an engineering flaw, it was the whole point. By building light, the Rhodians could make their statue stand 110 feet tall, the height of a 10-story building, without needing impossible amounts of bronze. The empty interior even served as a secret weapon. Winds whistling through the framework created an eerie moaning sound, convincing visitors the Colossus itself was alive and watching. This wasn't just artistic license. In 282 BCE, when Rhodes erected their giant, they'd just survived a brutal siege. Their treasury was drained, their navy weakened. They needed the world to believe they remained unconquerable, so they turned architecture into theater. That hollow statue functioned like a medieval suit of armor, intimidating on the outside but mostly empty space. Every trading ship that passed beneath its legs carried the story back home. Rhodes was so rich, so powerful, they could waste metal on a decoration the size of a lighthouse. Modern engineers have calculated the truth. If the Colossus had been solid bronze, it would have required over 12 times the metal actually used, enough to bankrupt the island. Instead, the Rhodians stretched their resources by using tricks still employed today. The statue's skin was no thicker than 2 coins stacked together in places, hammered so precisely that seams became invisible at a distance. The stone base, filled with rubble from demolished siege engines, a literal recycling of their enemies' failures into their own propaganda. What makes this lie so brilliant is how it weaponized human psychology. We instinctively equate size with strength, shine with wealth. The Rhodians knew no visiting diplomat would chip away at their national monument to check its authenticity. Just like modern cities building flashy skyscrapers to attract investment, they understood that perception could shape reality. For 56 years, until an earthquake toppled it, that hollow giant convinced the Mediterranean world that tiny Rhodes punched far above its weight, proving sometimes the most powerful structures aren't the ones built to last, but the ones built to dazzle. Louis XIV didn't just build a palace, he built an entire universe where he stood at the center. Step into the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and you're not just walking through a grand corridor, you're stepping into one of history's most brilliant optical illusions. Those famous mirrored walls weren't just decorative, they were psychological warfare in glass and gilt. A single candlelit chandelier becomes dozens. A handful of courtiers transforms into a teeming crowd, and what was really a corridor just 230 feet long appears to stretch into infinity. The genius wasn't in the mirrors themselves, but in their placement. Hung directly opposite the palace's towering windows, they didn't just reflect light, they multiplied it, creating the illusion that the entire hall was bathed in golden sunlight even on cloudy days. Visitors would swear the room had windows on both sides, a physical impossibility that made the space feel twice as large. And when the king entered, surrounded by his glittering entourage, the mirrors would create endless duplicates of his procession, making 20 men look like 200. But the deception didn't stop at the palace doors. Outside, the gardens continued the trickery with even more sophistication. Those perfectly manicured hedges weren't just decorative, they were carefully calculated to manipulate perspective. Paths widened gradually as they stretched away from the palace, making distances seem greater than they were. Hidden groves and sudden clearings broke up sightlines, so visitors could never quite grasp the garden's true scale. Even the fountains were strategically placed to create false horizons. What looked like the edge of the estate might actually be a cleverly sunken basin reflecting the sky. This wasn't just about showing off. Louis understood that in politics, perception was reality. By making his home seem infinitely vast, he made his power seem equally boundless. Diplomats leaving Versailles didn't just remember a beautiful palace, they carried with them the unsettling sense that the Sun King's influence stretched as far as those mirrored reflections, with no visible end. Modern architects still use these techniques today. Think of grand hotel lobbies or shopping malls designed to make you lose your bearings, but never with such single-minded purpose. Every inch of Versailles was engineered to reinforce one message. Here was a king so powerful he could bend space itself to his will. the mirrors didn't just reflect images, they reflected Louis' grandest lie that his reign had no limits, no edges, and certainly no challengers worthy of notice. Climb the steps of Chichen Itza's Great Pyramid today, and you're not just ascending a monument, you're walking through centuries of carefully crafted deception. The Temple of Kukulkan appears to be a single, awe-inspiring structure, but beneath its weathered stone hides a far more revealing truth. It's actually 3 pyramids stacked like nesting dolls, each layer burying the ambitions of rulers who came before. This wasn't just architectural evolution, it was history being rewritten in limestone and mortar. The genius of this illusion lies in its simplicity. When a new Mayan king took power, he wouldn't build his own temple from scratch. Instead, workers would envelop the existing pyramid in a fresh shell, expanding its footprint just enough to make it grander while preserving the sacred geometry. The old structure became both foundation and secret, its very existence erased from public memory. Imagine the psychological impact. A visiting dignitary would see only the latest, most imposing version, never suspecting that the new pyramid owed its stature to generations of hidden predecessors. Archaeologists discovered this layered truth in the 1930s, tunneling through the outer walls to find smaller, perfectly preserved temples inside. The innermost pyramid, likely built around 550 CE, stands 20 feet tall, a modest structure compared to the final version's 78-foot height. Each subsequent ruler didn't just add bulk, they manipulated perception. The outer pyramid steps are steeper, its terraces narrower, creating forced perspective that makes the whole structure appear taller when viewed from the plaza below. Even the famous serpent shadows that appear during equinoxes, those were carefully calibrated to align only with the final iteration, making the newest king's additions seem cosmically ordained. But why go to such lengths? In Mayan culture, buildings weren't just shelters, they were physical manifestations of a ruler's connection to the gods. A king who could grow a pyramid overnight demonstrated supernatural favor. The layered construction also served practical politics. By physically burying his predecessors' monuments, a new ruler symbolically absorbed their legacy while asserting dominance. It was architectural ancestor worship with a ruthless twist, honoring the past while ensuring no prior glory outshone the present. Modern restorations reveal just how calculated these deceptions were. At some sites, workers left hollow spaces between layers, creating resonant chambers that amplified ritual drums into earth-shaking booms. Other pyramids show evidence of sacrificial renovations, whole sections deliberately demolished not for structural reasons, but to erase symbolic carvings honoring previous rulers. The most telling detail, many inner pyramids have richer decorations than their outer shells, suggesting later kings prioritized sheer size over craftsmanship, trading artistry for awe. What makes these hidden layers so fascinating is how they mirror the Mayan worldview. Just as they saw time as cyclical rather than linear, their pyramids became physical timelines, each era contained within the next, visible only to those who knew where to look. Today, when tourists gasp at these monuments' scale, they're falling for the same illusion Mayan rulers engineered centuries ago. That greatness is measured not by what's built, but by what's left visible. The real story, messy, layered, and profoundly human, remains tucked away in the darkness between stones. Look up at the dome of Hagia Sophia, and you'll swear it's hovering, defying gravity itself. That's exactly what Ottoman architects wanted you to feel. When Mimar Sinan redesigned the skyline of Istanbul, he didn't just build domes, he engineered miracles of perception. The secret, a hidden skeleton of support systems carefully tucked out of sight. Those soaring curves that seem to float without effort actually rest on a complex web of pendentives, buttresses, and concealed columns, all designed to vanish from view when you stand beneath them. Take the dome at Selamei Mosque, Sinan's masterpiece. From the outside, it appears to balance delicately on thin air, its massive weight somehow suspended over the building. But step inside, and the illusion becomes even more brilliant. The interior is ringed with windows at the base of the dome, flooding the space with light that erases all shadows, making the supporting structures literally disappear against the glare. Your brain can't find the edges where stone meets sky, so the dome seems to expand infinitely upward. Sinan called this technique capturing the sky in a net, using architecture to mimic the heavens themselves. This wasn't just aesthetic showmanship, it was political theater written in brick and mortar. When the Ottomans converted Hagia Sophia from a church to a mosque, they needed to prove their empire could surpass Byzantine engineering. So they didn't just copy the original dome, they reinvented it with optical tricks that made Christian architects' achievements seem crude by comparison. The hidden supports allowed them to build wider spans than ever before, while the illusion of weightlessness sent a clear message. Ottoman rule wasn't just powerful, it was divinely ordained. Modern engineers have marveled at how these 16th century builders pulled it off. The pendentives, those curved triangular supports hidden in the dome's corners, aren't just structural, they're mathematical masterpieces. Each one is precisely angled to distribute weight along invisible lines, like a magician palming a coin. Even the dome's curvature is calculated to fool the eye, slightly flatter than a perfect hemisphere. It creates subtle distortions that enhance the sense of impossible scale. The most telling detail, many Ottoman mosques place their main dome directly over the prayer niche facing Mecca. Worshippers bowing in prayer would glance up and see this vast, unsupported canopy, a physical manifestation of Allah's limitless power channeled through the Sultan's architects. It was spiritual propaganda at its most sophisticated, turning stone and mortar into a visceral experience of awe. Today, when tourists crane their necks beneath these domes, they're falling for the same carefully crafted deception that convinced entire generations. True power isn't just about strength, it's about making the impossible seem effortless. The Great Wall snakes across mountains and deserts like an endless stone dragon, but that seamless image is itself one of history's most enduring architectural lies. What appears today as a continuous ribbon of brick and mortar was actually a fragmented network of walls built across centuries by warring states, often with gaps wide enough to march an army through. The Ming dynasty didn't just build fortifications, they crafted a myth of invincibility, stitching together disconnected ramparts and exaggerating their reach to create the illusion of an impenetrable barrier. Archaeologists now know the truth. Less than half of the Great Wall visible today dates to the Ming era, and much of it was constructed hastily using tamped earth rather than the iconic stone bricks we associate with it. Some sections were built parallel to each other for unclear reasons, while others abruptly ended at natural obstacles like rivers, hardly the strategic choice for a unified defense system. The most telling detail, Ming engineers often left intentional gaps in remote areas, relying on the terrain itself as a natural barrier while embellishing reports to the emperor about the wall's unbroken length. This deception worked because it targeted the psychology of potential invaders. Nomadic tribes surveying the wall from a distance couldn't discern where solid masonry gave way to rubble or empty space. Watchtowers were spaced just close enough to create the impression of constant surveillance, even where garrisons were thinly spread. Ming officials compounded the illusion by circulating maps showing a continuous line stretching thousands of miles, early propaganda that still shapes our textbooks today. Modern technology has revealed the full scale of the fabrication. Satellite imagery shows the wall branching into multiple parallel lines in some regions and disappearing entirely in others. In Gansu province, archaeologists found entire sections built not for defense, but as ceremonial facades, their western faces carefully constructed while the eastern sides remained rough, meant only to impress travelers arriving from the Silk Road. Even the famous uniform bricks, those only appear near Beijing, where foreign envoys would visit. Elsewhere, workers used whatever materials were at hand, from compacted reeds to salvaged temple stones. What makes this architectural lie so fascinating is how it weaponized distance and reputation. The wall's true power came not from being unbroken, but from convincing enemies it might be. Like a poker player betting big on a weak hand, the Ming dynasty turned partial fortifications into an unbeatable myth, one so persuasive that today, we still picture a single majestic wall winding across China, rather than the pragmatic patchwork it actually was. The lesson echoes through history. Sometimes the most effective barriers aren't made of stone, but of stories. Look up at the ceiling of Rome's Church of the Gesù, and you'll swear you're gazing straight into heaven, angels spiraling upward, clouds parting to reveal divine light, the architecture itself seeming to stretch endlessly toward the sky. Now reach out and touch it. That's when the illusion shatters. What appears to be a soaring dome is actually a flat wooden plank. Its miraculous depth nothing more than pigment and clever brushstrokes. This was Baroque Europe's greatest architectural sleight of hand. Ceilings that lied so convincingly, even skeptics had to blink twice. The technique called trompe-l'oeil, French for deceive the eye, turned financial constraints into artistic triumphs. Building a real dome required engineering genius, expensive materials, and years of labor. But a painter with mastery of perspective, they could create the same awe in weeks for a fraction of the cost. The Gesù's ceiling, painted by Giovanni Battista Goli in 1679, doesn't just mimic depth, it weaponizes it. Figures spill over faux architectural elements, some limbs appearing to dangle into the real space of the church. Shadows are painted at conflicting angles, tricking your brain into seeing multiple light sources. The result, a flat surface that seems to warp and bulge, pulling your gaze upward against all logic. What made these illusions so psychologically powerful was their timing. During Mass, as incense smoke curled toward the ceiling and candlelight flickered across the painted surface, the boundary between art and reality blurred completely. Worshippers would swear they saw the clouds move or angels descend, a divine endorsement of the church's authority. Jesuit priests understood something profound. A congregation that felt heaven physically close above them would open their purses more readily than one staring at plain timber beams. But the deception wasn't just spiritual. Royal palaces adopted the same tricks for more earthly purposes. At Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace, the Grand Gallery's ceiling appears to open to the sky, revealing Roman gods overseeing courtly gatherings. The message to visiting nobles was clear. Their host's power was so immense, even the heavens took notice. Painters achieved this by studying actual sunlight patterns in the room, then replicating them in pigments so at high noon, painted shadows aligned perfectly with real ones, selling the fantasy. Modern restorations reveal just how calculated these illusions were. At the Gesù, conservators found Goli had mixed glass powder into his white paint, making celestial light literally sparkle when candles hit it. Other artists layered varnishes to create translucent effects, so colors shifted as viewers moved beneath them. The most audacious trick, some ceilings incorporated real architectural elements at the edges, a protruding cornice here, a three-dimensional molding there, to blur where the physical structure ended and the painting began. These ceilings weren't just art, they were early virtual reality, crafting experiences that bypassed rationality to speak directly to the subconscious. When we look up at them today, our modern eyes trained by cinema and CGI still fall for the ruse. That's the ultimate testament to their power. Even knowing the trick, we can't help but feel the heavens opening above us, proving some illusions are too beautiful to outgrow. Run your fingers along the walls of Machu Picchu, and you'll feel nothing but cold, perfect stone blocks fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a hair between them. But tilt your head just right, and sunlight reveals the truth. Some joints aren't seamless at all. The Inca didn't just cut stones with impossible precision. They mastered the art of hiding their shortcuts in plain sight. Those legendary mortarless walls, many were secretly packed with clay, small pebbles, or even crushed shells, carefully concealed in shadows or beneath overhanging edges. This wasn't shoddy workmanship, it was architectural sleight of hand on an imperial scale. The real stroke of genius was how these hidden fillers actually strengthened the illusion. In earthquake-prone regions, the clay acted as a shock absorber, letting walls shift slightly without collapsing. Over time, weather would wash away the softer material, leaving only the tightly interlocked stones visible, creating the myth that every Inca wall had been perfect from the start. At Sacsayhuaman, the zigzagging fortress walls near Cusco, workers went further. They shaped some filler stones like puzzle pieces, wedging them into gaps from behind so the outer face appeared flawlessly carved. Why go through such elaborate deception? Because the Inca understood that reputation could be their most formidable defense. A kingdom that appeared to command stone as if it were soft clay would give enemies pause. Visiting dignitaries from rival nations, seeing these impossibly fitted walls, would assume the Inca possessed tools or knowledge beyond human capability, perhaps even divine favor. The psychological impact was calculated. Walls that seemed magically joined required no visible mortar, just as Inca rule required no visible opposition. Modern laser scans have exposed the full extent of the trickery. At Ollantaytambo, thermal imaging shows temperature variations revealing hidden clay deposits between stones. Some blocks thought to weigh dozens of tons are actually smaller pieces cleverly shaped to look monolithic. The most telling detail, Inca masons often left the backs of stones rough and unfinished, concentrating all their precision work on the visible surfaces, proof that these were illusions meant for public consumption, not engineering miracles. What makes this architectural lie so enduring is how it plays with our assumptions. We see perfection and assume it must be universal, not realizing the Inca were early masters of the Instagram effect, crafting flawless facades while hiding the messy reality behind them. Their walls weren't just structures, they were stone-carved propaganda, whispering to every observer that this empire could bend the very earth to its will. And centuries later, as tourists still marvel at seams they can't penetrate, the illusion holds firm, proving some deceptions outlast the civilizations that built them. Step into the Epidona Hall at Persepolis, and your eyes would immediately betray you. Stretching in every direction stood forests of towering columns, each one identical, each one perfectly spaced, creating a dizzying effect of infinite repetition. The Persian emperors didn't just build a throne room, they engineered a hypnotic trance in stone. At first glance, visitors swore the hall extended farther than the eye could see, its polished surfaces reflecting endless duplicates of every carved bull's head and lotus blossom. But the truth, the entire space measured just 260 feet square, smaller than a modern football field. The genius lay in the details. Those 72 columns weren't randomly placed. They stood in precise grids of 6 by 12, spaced just far enough apart to prevent visitors from ever taking in the full room at once. From any vantage point, your line of sight would intersect with multiple rows, creating overlapping layers that scrambled depth perception. The uniformity was weaponized. Every capital featured twin bull protomes, their curled horns catching the light at identical angles, while fluted shafts cast parallel shadows that seemed to converge in the distance. It was like standing between two mirrors, reality multiplied until you lost all sense of scale. Persian architects amplified the illusion with psychological tricks. The floor sloped almost imperceptibly toward the throne, forcing visitors to walk uphill toward King Darius, subtly making him appear larger. Wall reliefs showed endless processions of tribute bearers, 23 delegations from across the empire, each figure identical in size and posture, reinforcing the message of inexhaustible resources. Even the material choices deceived. Polished limestone reflected torchlight unevenly, making it impossible to judge distances accurately in the flickering glow. Modern archaeologists have measured the actual floor space and found something revealing. The hall's capacity was carefully calculated to hold exactly 7,200 guests, a number chosen not for practicality, but for its symbolic weight in Persian cosmology. Yet no contemporary account ever mentions feeling crowded. Instead, ambassadors wrote of vastness beyond comprehension. That's because the columns created artificial choke points, breaking the crowd into isolated pockets where no one could gather enough visual information to gauge the true size. The most brilliant deception, the Epidona's columns weren't even solid stone. Core samples reveal many were stacked drums cleverly fitted together, their seams hidden beneath gilded bronze bands. Like a magician's false-bottomed box, the hall used superficial splendor to mask its structural shortcuts. When Alexander the Great burned Persepolis in 330 BCE, the flames exposed the truth. Those limitless columns toppled quickly because their inner joints lacked mortar. But for nearly 2 centuries, this architectural hallucination convinced the world that Persia's wealth and power knew no bounds. The lesson echoes through history. Sometimes, overwhelming repetition isn't just design, it's the ultimate sleight of hand. Gothic cathedrals didn't soar toward heaven through sheer stone strength. They floated there on a carefully concealed web of structural lies. Those iconic flying buttresses framing Notre Dame weren't just architectural flourishes. They were emergency braces for walls too ambitious to stand on their own. The real deception, while the exterior boasted these dramatic stone arcs, the interior presented an entirely different story. Walls so perforated with stained glass they resembled delicate lace more than fortress ramparts. This was architecture as high-stakes balancing act, where every glowing biblical scene in those towering windows came at the cost of structural integrity. Medieval builders played a brilliant psychological game. By concentrating the cathedral's weight into slender columns and hidden ribbed vaults inside, they created cavernous spaces that seemed to defy physics. Worshippers gazing upward would see only airy grace, never the external buttresses working overtime to prevent collapse. The stained glass served double duty, divine storytelling for the faithful and perfect camouflage for the thinness of the walls. Sunlight streaming through biblical scenes dazzled the eye, making worshippers overlook how little solid stone actually surrounded them. Modern laser scans reveal just how precarious this illusion was. Notre Dame's famous rose windows, for all their beauty, weakened the walls so significantly that the surrounding masonry bears stress fractures dating back to the 13th century. The cathedral's iconic spire, added centuries later, wasn't just decorative, it functioned as a counterweight, helping stabilize walls that were never designed to support such height. Even the flying buttresses themselves evolved over time, growing thicker and more numerous as builders realized their initial calculations had been dangerously optimistic. What makes this architectural lie so fascinating is how it reflects medieval theology. Just as Christian doctrine emphasized God's power working through human weakness, these cathedrals turned structural vulnerabilities into spiritual statements. The very fragility of those stone-lace curtains became proof of divine intervention. How else could something so delicate stand so tall? Pilgrims who traveled for miles to see these marvels weren't just visiting buildings, they were witnessing what appeared to be miracles in stone. The ultimate irony came in 2019, when Notre Dame's fire exposed centuries of hidden patch jobs. As flames consumed the roof, they revealed iron staples medieval masons had secretly embedded throughout the structure, early reinforcements they'd never publicized. Even the original builders knew their heavenly vision rested on earthly compromises. Today's restorers face the same dilemma: preserve the illusion of effortless grace, or expose the truth that these stone prayers have always needed mortal hands to keep them standing. The cathedrals endure not as testaments to perfect engineering, but to humanity's eternal desire to reach beyond our grasp, even if we have to cheat gravity to do it. China's Tang dynasty didn't just build cities, they built theater sets on an imperial scale. Walk through the gates of ancient Chang'an, and you'd find neighborhoods teeming with perfectly constructed homes, bustling market squares, even government offices, all eerily vacant. These weren't abandoned districts, they were deliberate illusions, stagecraft in brick and timber, designed to convince visiting envoys that the empire's wealth and population knew no bounds. Imagine a foreign diplomat riding through the eastern markets, seeing stall after stall stocked with silk and spices, only to later realize the merchants were imperial actors and the goods just shuffled between locations to create the illusion of endless commerce. The genius of these ghost cities lay in their psychological precision. Chang'an's planners constructed entire districts with subtle tells: doors that didn't open, chimneys that never smoked, streets worn smooth by staged foot traffic rather than genuine use. The palace even maintained a permanent core of urban extras. Peasants paid to populate certain quarters when foreign caravans arrived. These weren't slums. The buildings matched the quality of real neighborhoods, down to the carved eaves and painted beams. But behind those ornate facades, empty shells, some with unfinished interiors or hastily erected partition walls that would collapse if leaned against too hard. Why go to such extravagant lengths? Because in 8th century Asia, perception dictated power. When Tibetan or Turkic envoys reported back about Chang'an's unimaginable size, their khans hesitated before challenging an empire that could apparently waste resources on unused infrastructure. The deception worked both ways. Domestic visitors from provincial towns would return home spreading tales of the capital's boundless prosperity, discouraging rebellion. Even tax collection benefited. Regional governors, awed by the capital's apparent wealth, rarely questioned the emperor's demands. Modern archaeology has uncovered the full extent of the charade. Soil samples from residential districts show no traces of cooking fires or waste pits. Foundation stones bear quarry marks but no weathering, proving buildings went up shortly before being demolished. The most telling clue: imperial records casually mention rotating display populations between different ghost neighborhoods, like stagehands rearranging props between acts. What makes these empty cities so fascinating is how they mirror modern propaganda tactics. Just as today's authoritarian regimes construct Potemkin villages for foreign journalists, the Tang understood that controlling perception could be more effective than controlling reality. Their ghost districts required no standing army to enforce their message, just the lingering doubt in any visitor's mind. If this much wealth could be squandered on empty buildings, what unimaginable reserves must the emperor truly possess? The lesson echoes through history. Sometimes the most convincing lies aren't told with words, but with carefully placed walls and deliberately silent streets. The Leaning Tower of Pisa didn't start as a masterpiece, it began as a humiliating engineering blunder. When construction began in 1173, The soft, unstable ground beneath its foundation caused the tower to start tilting before workers had even finished the third level. For decades, builders tried to compensate, adjusting column heights, adding extra support on one side, but the tilt only worsened. By the time the bell chamber was added in 1372, the tower leaned a staggering 5 degrees off-center. What should have been a civic embarrassment, though, became Pisa's greatest propaganda victory. Rather than admit failure, city officials spun the tilt as a bold statement of defiance. They claimed their tower didn't just reach toward heaven, it laughed in the face of gravity itself. The imperfection became a point of pride, proof that Pisa's architects dared what others wouldn't attempt. Visitors arriving by ship would see the tower first, its dramatic lean making it appear even taller against the skyline. Rival city-states like Florence and Genoa, with their perfectly upright towers, suddenly looked conventional by comparison. Modern engineers have uncovered how much of this audacious design was pure myth. 14th century records show workers secretly digging soil from beneath the high side to correct the tilt, then abandoning the effort when it risked making the tower look ordinary. The marble cladding was cut at varying thicknesses to exaggerate the lean from certain angles, while the staircase inside spirals opposite to the tilt, creating disorienting effects that made the slope feel more extreme. Even the famous 7 bells were carefully weighted, the heaviest placed on the high side to prevent further leaning, while smaller bells on the low side maintained the illusion of precarious imbalance. What makes this architectural lie so enduring is how it turned weakness into legend. The same unstable soil that nearly doomed the tower became part of its mystique, proof that Pisa could build where others couldn't. When Galileo supposedly dropped weights from the tower to study gravity, the story spread not because of its scientific merit, historians doubt it happened, but because it reinforced the narrative of Pisan ingenuity triumphing over nature's laws. Today, as tourists still line up to take photos holding up the tower, they're participating in an 800-year-old tradition, celebrating not what the builders intended, but the glorious accident they had the wisdom to embrace. The lesson echoes through every crooked brick. Sometimes the most powerful statements aren't made by achieving perfection, but by convincing the world your mistakes were part of the plan all along. When Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on Tenochtitlan, they swore they were witnessing magic, entire gardens drifting across Lake Texcoco like emerald rafts. These floating chinampas, heavy with maize and flowers, seem to defy nature itself, but reach beneath the water's surface, and your fingers would brush against the truth. Long wooden stakes driven deep into the lakebed, anchoring each floating plot to the earth below. This was agricultural genius disguised as divine spectacle, a lie so persuasive it convinced even the Aztecs' enemies of their supernatural prowess. The Chinampa's brilliance lay in their layered deception. Built from woven reeds and rich mud, these artificial islands appeared to ride the waves freely when viewed from shore. But their creators knew the secret willow trees planted along the edges sent roots shooting downward, knitting the structure to the lake bottom like invisible stitches. Farmers paddling between plots reinforced the illusion, their canoes gliding effortlessly over hidden anchor lines. To the untrained eye, it looked as though the earth itself obeyed Aztec command, rearranging itself for their harvests. Why stage such an elaborate ruse? Because in an empire built on both tribute and terror, perception mattered as much as productivity. Neighboring city-states sending envoys to Tenochtitlan would see these miraculous gardens and assume the Aztecs had tamed the very elements. The effect was compounded by strategic staging chinampas clustered near ceremonial causeways where visitors passed, their bounty always on display. Meanwhile, mundane but crucial details like crop rotation or irrigation channels were hidden beneath the waterline, preserving the myth of effortless abundance. Modern archaeologists have uncovered how carefully engineered this illusion was. Core samples reveal chinampa bases layered with volcanic rock for stability, a technique borrowed from Aztec temple construction. The stakes weren't just functional, they were arranged in symbolic patterns mirroring celestial constellations, turning agricultural infrastructure into covert cosmology lessons. Even the crops played their part. Fast-growing flowers bordered each plot, creating perpetual blooms that masked seasonal changes and made harvests seem endless. The most telling detail, Spanish chronicles describe Aztec priests blessing the gardens to keep them afloat during festivals. In reality, these rituals coincided with the dry season when water levels dropped, making the chinampas appear to levitate higher. It was agricultural theater at its finest, blurring the line between practical farming and state-sponsored mysticism. Today, as Mexico City's last surviving chinampas still produce crops using these ancient methods, they serve as a reminder. Sometimes the most fertile ground for growth isn't just soil, it's the space between what's real and what we're persuaded to believe. Shimmering across the vaulted ceilings of Hagia Sophia, the golden mosaics seemed proof of Byzantium's boundless wealth until you got close enough to touch them. What appeared to be solid gold tiles were actually masterpieces of optical deception, thin glass squares backed with silver leaf, carefully positioned to catch and multiply candlelight. This wasn't just thriftiness, it was alchemy with light and shadow, turning modest materials into divine radiance. The technique, called gold sandwich glass, reveals Byzantine ingenuity at its most pragmatic. Artisans would sandwich a layer of silver foil between two panes of glass, then fire the tile until the layers fused. When mounted at precise angles high above the nave, these tiles refracted light so brilliantly that even emperors kneeling below couldn't distinguish them from solid gold. The effect was magnified by the dome's curvature, each tiny tile acting like a mirror, bouncing illumination across the cavernous space until the entire ceiling seemed to hover, bathed in supernatural glow. Why such elaborate deception? Because Constantinople's power relied on the illusion of inexhaustible riches. Foreign ambassadors attending ceremonies would return home with tales of a city literally gilded in gold, never suspecting that much of it was clever fakery. Even more crucially, the mosaics served theological propaganda. By making earthly architecture appear to dissolve into heavenly light, they reinforced the idea that Byzantium was God's chosen empire. The message was clear. Divine favor shone so brightly here that even the walls transcended mortal materials. Modern restorers have uncovered the full extent of the trickery. Some gold tiles contain barely a whisper of silver, their backs painted with reflective pigments instead. Others reveal recycled glass from earlier Roman buildings, their imperfections hidden under layers of grout. The most telling detail, many tiles were deliberately cracked during installation, not by accident, but to create additional light-scattering surfaces that enhanced the shimmer. The brilliance of this lie lies in its longevity. Centuries after the fall of Byzantium, visitors still gasp at Hagia Sophia's golden aura, proving the illusion outlasted the empire that crafted it. In a way, those glass tiles became the perfect metaphor for Byzantine rule, a fragile construct that dazzled the world by bending light to its will, convincing generations to see not what was there, but what they desperately wanted to believe. Stroll through the grand halls of the British Museum, and your fingers will brush against what seems to be cool, polished marble, smooth as a river stone, veined with whispers of grey and gold. But press a little harder and the truth reveals itself. That marble has no weight, no crystalline depth. It's scagliola, a masterful blend of plaster, glue, and pigment that fooled even the most discerning Victorian eyes. This wasn't just cost-cutting, it was alchemy on an industrial scale, turning humble materials into imperial theater. The deception worked because it played on human nature. Wealthy patrons expected marble in their institutions. It spoke of permanence, of Britain's unshakable place in the world. But quarrying and transporting real stone was prohibitively expensive. So craftsmen developed scagliola, a material so convincing. It could mimic not just Carrara marble's milky whiteness, but the rare green serpentine of the Alps or the rosy blush of Egyptian porphyry. The technique was painstaking. Layers of colored plaster were troweled on, then polished for hours with agate stones until they gleamed like geological fate. In some cases, artisans even embedded threads of silk to replicate marble's natural veins, creating a material more perfect than nature itself. Why go to such lengths? Because Victorian Britain was staging a global performance. Every faux marble column in the British Museum whispered to visitors, "We command resources so vast, we can clad entire buildings in the rarest stones." Meanwhile, industrialists used the same trick in their factories, coating iron pillars with scagliola to make sweatshops resemble Renaissance palaces. Even churches joined the charade, painting plaster to look like marble altars, turning piety into another prop in the empire's grand production. Modern conservators have uncovered the full genius and irony of these illusions. X-rays show how scagliola often adhered better than real marble, resisting cracks that plagued genuine stone in London's damp climate. Some faux columns actually grew more beautiful with age, their pigments mellowing into hues no quarry could produce. The most telling detail, many original craftsmen left hidden signatures in their work, tiny brushstrokes of anachronistic colors, like ultramarine in a marble that would never contain it. These weren't mistakes, they were quiet rebellions, proof that the era's greatest artistry often lay in its most audacious lies. What makes this architectural deception so poignant is how it mirrors Victorian society itself. Just as scagliola masked cheap plaster with a veneer of grandeur, the empire masked its social fractures with pomp and pageantry. Today, when we admire these surfaces, we're not just seeing clever craftsmanship, we're seeing the blueprint of an age that understood truth mattered less than the conviction it inspired. The real marvel isn't that they fooled us, but that we're still dazzled by the trick centuries later. Parisians first glimpsed the Eiffel Tower as a monstrous skeleton, an iron intruder elbowing its way into their skyline. Newspapers called it a tragic lamppost, artists signed petitions demanding its demolition, and critics sneered that its only purpose was to prove France could waste 300 meters of metal. What none of them realized was that this so-called eyesore had an expiration date from the start. Gustave Eiffel's contract with the city explicitly stated his tower would stand for just 20 years before being dismantled like a World's Fair carnival attraction. The audacious structure wasn't meant to endure, it was designed to shock, then vanish. So how did this temporary eyesore become the immortal symbol of Paris? Through a campaign of reinvention so relentless, it turned public disdain into patriotic pride. Eiffel knew his creation needed practical value to survive, so he aggressively marketed it as a scientific asset. Within months of the 1889 exposition, he'd installed meteorology labs at the summit and convinced the military to test wireless telegraphy from its heights. When these experiments proved successful, he framed the tower not as art but as essential infrastructure, a patriotically French contribution to progress. The tower's savviest deception was hiding its impermanence in plain sight. Those iconic iron arches weren't just structural, they formed perfect parabolic curves ideal for radio transmission. By 1921, when the demolition deadline loomed, Eiffel had already leased the tower to the French army as a radio antenna. Suddenly, tearing it down wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a national security risk. The temporary structure had quietly wired itself into France's defense network, making its removal unthinkable. Modern restorations reveal how flimsy the original construction truly was. The iron, chosen for its lightness rather than durability, was only a quarter-inch thick in places, more suitable for a railway bridge than a permanent monument. Early corrosion repairs show workers essentially rebuilding entire sections within the first decade. The tower's endurance owes less to 19th century engineering than to 20th century paint. 25,000 gallons applied every 7 years in a carefully calculated 3-tone gradient that makes the structure appear more substantial from below. What makes this architectural lie so brilliant is how it weaponized time. The tower didn't win Parisians over by changing, it outlasted them, standing long enough for new generations to forget the controversy and embrace it as heritage. Today, when we admire those iron curves, we're not seeing some timeless masterpiece. We're witnessing the ultimate PR victory, a structure that convinced the world it belonged simply by refusing to leave. The real lesson isn't about engineering, it's about persistence. Sometimes the difference between an eyesore and an icon is just a matter of waiting for the critics to die off. Stand before the Taj Mahal's iconic reflecting pools at dawn, and you'll swear they stretch into eternity, a liquid pathway dissolving into the horizon. But take 10 steps backward and the illusion unravels. Those shimmering channels aren't uniform rectangles at all. They're masterpieces of optical engineering, subtly tapered so the far end measures nearly a third narrower than where you stand. This vanishing act wasn't an architectural quirk, it was Shah Jahan's love letter written in hydraulics and geometry, designed to make grief feel infinite. The trick lies in the gradient. Each 4-foot-wide pool slopes almost imperceptibly upward, rising just 1 inch every 40 feet, enough to compress sight lines without registering consciously. The water's mirror surface completes the deception, blending seamlessly with the Yamuna River's distant glint to erase all boundaries. From the main gateway, this creates a heart-stopping effect. The Taj doesn't just sit beside water, it floats atop an endless plain of liquid sky, its domes and minarets perfectly multiplied in the reflection. Mughal engineers called this technique Raqs-e-Mai, the dance of water, using fluid dynamics as stagecraft. Modern laser surveys reveal how calculated every element was. The pools narrow precisely following the golden ratio, ensuring the perspective feels naturally expansive rather than artificially stretched. Even the lotus-shaped fountains play their part. Their spacing tightens gradually toward the mausoleum, subconsciously drawing the eye forward. The most revealing detail, original 17th century plans show gardeners were instructed to prune surrounding cypress trees asymmetrically, keeping those on the far end shorter to enhance the false depth. Why orchestrate such an elaborate aquatic illusion? Because the Taj was never just a tomb, it was political theater. Shah Jahan, deposed by his own son before construction finished, needed the world to remember his reign as one of undying love rather than failed ambition. By making the complex appear vaster than reality, he turned architecture into emotional algebra. If a mortal man could command space itself to bow to his grief, surely his devotion transcended human limits. Visitors today still fall for the trick. Photographers jostle to capture that perfect reflection shot, unknowingly framing their compositions to exploit the Mughals' hidden gradients. The pools work so well because they appeal to our deepest longing, to believe that love, like their engineered infinity, knows no edges, and perhaps that's the most enduring deception of all. Not that the Taj seems larger than it is, but that it makes us forget architecture's limits altogether, leaving only the ache of something too beautiful to be contained by mere stone. Wander through an 18th-century English garden, and you might stumble upon a haunting sight, a crumbling Roman temple, its columns broken, its pediment cracked with age. But look closer, that moss isn't centuries old, it was carefully cultivated. Those weathered stones were deliberately chiseled to look decrepit. These weren't accidental ruins, they were status symbols in disguise, stagecraft for aristocrats desperate to rewrite their family histories. At Storehead in Wiltshire, the Temple of Flora stands as a masterclass in this architectural deception. Built in 1745, its columns were artificially aged with acid washes, while craftsmen used hammers to mimic centuries of erosion. The surrounding plantings were no accident either. Ivy was trained to creep over specific sections, creating the illusion of nature reclaiming man's work. Wealthy landowners like Henry Hoare didn't just want beauty, they needed visitors to believe his family's roots stretched back to antiquity, not a fortune made in banking. The psychology behind these follies reveals a delicious irony. While actual Roman ruins were being plundered for materials across Europe, the nouveau rich were paying top dollar to construct brand new antiquities. Architects like William Kent became specialists in artificial decay, developing techniques to stain marble with yogurt cultures for instant patina or embed counterfeit, ancient inscriptions in fake Latin. At Paintshill Park in Surrey, a Gothic tower was constructed with pre-cracked windows not because the owner admired medieval architecture, but because he needed his guests to assume it had always been there. Modern conservation efforts have exposed the full extent of the charade. At Stowe, X-rays revealed iron rods hidden inside crumbling limestone columns, ensuring structural stability while maintaining the illusion of fragility. Elsewhere, landscapers discovered drainage systems disguised as natural streams, designed to keep these staged ruins photogenically damp, the most telling detail. Many follies were strategically placed just out of reach, preventing close inspection that might reveal fresh mortar or machined stone. What makes these garden lies so fascinating is how they mirror the social anxieties of their time. In an era when bloodlines meant more than bank balances, a well-placed ruin could whisper what money couldn't shout, that your family had always belonged among the elite. Today, as tourists admire these theatrical decays, they're participating in a centuries-old game of make-believe, where the richest prize wasn't owning history, but convincing others you'd been part of it all along. Step into the so-called Palace of Knossos on Crete, and you'll walk through corridors painted in vivid reds and blues, past frescoes of leaping dolphins and snake-wielding priestesses. But here's the unsettling truth. Much of what you're seeing isn't ancient Minoan civilization at all. It's the early 20th century imagination of British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who didn't just excavate the site, he rebuilt it according to his own romantic visions, turning scattered ruins into a concrete fantasy of what he thought Bronze Age royalty should look like. The most famous deception, the labyrinth, Evans popularized the idea that Knossos was the mythical maze of the Minotaur, despite zero physical evidence of such a structure. Those twisting corridors visitors marvel at today weren't uncovered. They were designed by Evans' team, complete with poured concrete columns and repainted frescoes based on tiny fragments. Modern archaeologists have found his field notes admitting some restorations were pure conjecture, like the grand staircase reconstructed from just 3 remaining steps. Even the iconic bull leaping fresco, only 15% original, the rest is imaginative filler. Why such creative liberties? Because Evans wasn't just an archaeologist, he was a showman. Excavating in the early 1900s, he needed sponsors and public fascination to fund his work. By presenting Knossos as the labyrinth of legend, he guaranteed newspaper headlines and tourist traffic. Workers under his direction even used reinforced concrete, a material the Minoans never knew, to make reconstructions durable enough for visitors, blurring the line between preservation and invention. The consequences ripple through history, those colorful columns now synonymous with Minoan architecture. Evans painted them that way based on a single pigment trace. The throne room, displayed as the oldest in Europe, its ceremonial function was likely exaggerated to match Homeric tales. Worst of all, genuine artifacts were sometimes altered to fit Evans' narrative, pottery shards glued into shapes they never formed, wall fragments extended with modern plaster. Recent laser scans reveal the full extent of the fabrication. Original walls bear tool marks from 1920s trowels, not ancient chisels. Some ancient drainage systems turn out to be modern pipes concealed beneath replica stones. The most damning evidence, Evans' own reconstruction plans show where he moved entire walls to create more dramatic spaces, literally rewriting the palace layout to suit his vision. What makes this architectural lie so insidious is how it shaped our understanding of an entire civilization. Generations of textbooks feature Evans' colorful fantasies as historical fact, proving that when we let myth dictate archaeology, we don't just reconstruct buildings, we rebuild the past in our own image. The real labyrinth of Knossos isn't beneath your feet, it's the tangled maze of fact and fiction we're still trying to navigate today. Rising from Moscow's skyline like a jagged crown, the spire of Moscow State University seems carved from solid stone, a towering testament to Soviet might. But chip away at that gleaming facade, and you'd hit hollow metal within inches. These Stalinist Seven Sisters weren't skyscrapers in the American sense. They were stage sets in reinforced concrete, their grandeur stretched thin over skeletal steel frames like frosting over a cardboard cake. Post-war USSR faced a brutal paradox, desperate to project strength after 20 million war dead, yet bankrupt from the conflict's devastation. The solution? Architectural sleight of hand. Workers stacked prefabricated panels as thin as 6 inches to create those iconic step towers, while hidden steel frameworks bore the actual weight. From a distance, the buildings appeared monolithic, their neoclassical details painstakingly molded from cheap cement mixed with rubble from bombed-out cities. Up close, the truth whispered through cracks, spiderwebbing across facades within years, elevator shafts too narrow for modern use, entire wings heated so inefficiently that winter frost crept indoors. The deception wasn't just structural, it was mathematical. Architects employed forced perspective tricks borrowed from theater design. Smaller upper floors made the towers appear taller than their actual height, while oversized stars atop spires, some weighing 12 tons, drew the eye upward, masking squat proportions at street level. The university's central tower, for instance, uses 24,000 strategically placed windows to create a shimmering effect that distracts from its boxy silhouette. Why such extravagance in austerity? Because these buildings weren't shelters, they were billboards. Each wedding cake skyscraper housed either government offices, elite residences, or prestigious institutions, their exaggerated height symbolizing socialism's triumph over capitalist pragmatism. When Khrushchev later denounced Stalin's architectural excesses, he wasn't just criticizing aesthetics, he was exposing the economic strain of maintaining these plaster giants, where ornate lobbies hid buckling load-bearing walls. Modern engineers have uncovered even darker truths. Original blueprints show some foundations designed with deliberately exaggerated depth measurements, not because the soil required it, but to intimidate Western observers who might obtain the plans. The university's famous 36-ton clock faces, their gears were so poorly cast they often jammed, forcing workers to manually adjust the hands. Yet for all their flaws, these buildings achieved their true purpose, convincing both citizens and rivals that the USSR could outbuild, out-engineer, and out-dream the West. The ultimate irony came during renovations in the 1990s, when workers peeled back facades to find wartime shrapnel embedded in the steel, literal battlefield scars disguised under layers of plaster. These towers weren't just lies, they were battle cries in brick and mortar, proving that sometimes the most powerful structures aren't those that stand the test of time, but those that shape what people believe while they still can. Dubai's skyline sparkles like a mirage, towers of glass and steel punching through the desert haze, their silhouettes stretching toward the stratosphere. But step inside many of these iconic structures and you'll find a different story. Behind those mirrored facades, entire floors sit empty, elevators never installed, and luxury penthouses are bare concrete shells. The Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, embodies this contradiction, a global symbol of opulence that, upon closer inspection, reveals the frantic race to build faster than practicality allowed. The deception begins with the numbers. While official brochures boast hundreds of floors, nearly a third of the Burj's interior remained unfinished for years after its grand opening. Workers recount installing temporary walls just before VIP tours, creating the illusion of completed spaces where none existed. The building's spine, engineered to sway almost 6 feet at the top, was designed for height records, not human comfort. Residents on upper floors report nausea during high winds, while maintenance crews joke about cloud sickness from the constant motion. But the real sleight of hand lies in the labor behind the glitter. Over 90% of Dubai's construction workforce were imported from South Asia on temporary visas, paid wages that wouldn't cover a night in the hotels they built. Their living conditions, often hidden in desert camps far from tourist zones, became the unspoken foundation of this architectural wonder. The Burj's record-breaking timeline wasn't just ambitious, it relied on round-the-clock shifts in 100-degree heat, with safety violations routinely overlooked in the rush to meet deadlines. Modern drone inspections reveal the shortcuts hidden beneath the glamour. Some premium towers use cheaper aluminum cladding instead of promised titanium, their panels already warping under the desert sun. Others feature emergency stairwells that dead end or mechanical systems inaccessible without dismantling walls, floors covered up by strategic photography and carefully choreographed investor tours. Even the Burj's famous fountain show, which consumes enough water daily to fill several Olympic pools, relies on a hidden underground recycling system the brochures never mention. What makes this architectural illusion so compelling is how it mirrors Dubai's economic model built on perception rather than substance. The city's developers understood that in an era of Instagram and global branding, what a building symbolized mattered more than how it functioned. Today, as newer towers rise with even more audacious designs, they carry forward the same unspoken rule. In the desert of reality, sometimes the most valuable resource isn't oil or water, but the ability to make the world believe in mirages. Perched above Los Angeles like a promise, the Hollywood sign wasn't built to last. It was supposed to vanish after 18 months. Originally reading Hollywoodland, those 50-foot tall letters erected in 1923 were nothing more than a flashy real estate ad, their flimsy wooden frames held together with chicken wire and hope. Developers never imagined their temporary marketing stunt would become the ultimate symbol of Tinseltown's grand illusions, outliving the neighborhood it advertised and transforming into a global icon of ambition itself. The sign's first deception was its sheer fragility. Built on a shoestring budget, each letter swayed dangerously in the Santa Ana winds, with workmen rappelling down weekly to reattach loose panels. The original bulbs outlining the letters 4,000 in total burned out so frequently that maintenance became a full-time job. Yet from the smoggy basin below, the sign appeared solid, even glamorous, a perfect metaphor for an industry built on smoke and mirrors. When the "land" suffix was quietly dropped in 1949, it wasn't just a cosmetic change. It marked the moment Hollywood stopped selling property and started selling itself as a concept. What makes this architectural lie so poignant is how accurately it mirrored the town beneath it. Just as movie sets used false fronts to create entire neighborhoods, the sign's rickety scaffolding stood in for permanence it never truly had. By the 1970s, the letters had decayed into a fitting parody of faded stardom. The H toppled over, the OS reduced to splintered circles. Its resurrection in 1978 with steel foundations and concrete footings completed the cycle, a temporary prop rebuilt as an immortal monument, much like the celebrities who flocked to the hills below. Modern imaging technology reveals the full extent of the charade. Core samples show the current sign's concrete piers extend barely 6 feet into the drought-prone soil, enough to withstand earthquakes on camera, but not the test of geological time. The gleaming white paint, a special reflective coating that makes the letters appear brighter on film than to the naked eye, continuing the tradition of prioritizing perception over substance. Even the surrounding parkland is an illusion. What looks like pristine wilderness is actually a fire-prone thicket of non-native vegetation, meticulously managed to frame the perfect Instagram shot. The sign's enduring power comes from being the ultimate Hollywood production, a set piece that convinced the world it was always meant to be there. Like a starlet who remade her origin story, it shed its humble beginnings to become something larger than life, proof that in Los Angeles, even the landscape knows how to play a leading role. Every tourist who snaps a selfie with those letters is participating in the same fantasy that built them, that some illusions, if maintained with enough confidence, eventually become truth. Las Vegas doesn't just borrow from other cities, it shrinks them down to size, polishes away their flaws, and sells them back to us as something better than reality. Take the Venetian's canals, where gondolas glide through crystal-clear water under a perpetually blue sky, a postcard version of Venice stripped of its crowds, its crumbling foundations, even its natural light. The real Venetian canals, they're murky, unpredictable, and smell faintly of history. But in Vegas, the water is dyed Caribbean turquoise, the gondoliers sing on cue, and the ceiling mimics twilight even at noon. This isn't just imitation, it's architectural airbrushing, turning centuries of complex history into a 90-minute dinner package. The genius lies in what's omitted as much as what's built. Paris Las Vegas replicates the Eiffel Tower at half scale but leaves out the Seine's grimy embankments. New York condenses Manhattan's skyline into a single block but skips the subway grates and sidewalk cracks. These aren't cities, they're highlight reels, three-dimensional fantasies where every angle is optimized for Instagram. Psychologists call this compression, the way our brains edit memories to emphasize pleasure over discomfort. Vegas takes that instinct and monetizes it, building environments that feel more real than reality because they cater exclusively to our idealized expectations. Behind the scenes, the deception runs deeper. Those Venetian canals, they recirculate the same 80,000 gallons of filtered water daily, a closed system as artificial as the trompe-l'oeil frescoes overhead. The cobblestones underfoot are textured concrete, worn just enough to suggest age without actual unevenness. Even the gondoliers' accents are part of the act. Many are trained actors from California, not Venice, coached to lean into stereotypes visitors expect. The most telling detail, real Venetian canals follow the natural topography. Vegas' version runs in mathematically perfect loops to maximize foot traffic past high-end shops. This illusion isn't harmless fun, it rewires our expectations. Studies show tourists who visit Vegas, Paris first often feel disappointed by the actual city of light, complaining about missing elements that never existed outside the casino. The phenomenon even has a name, Paris Syndrome, originally coined for Japanese travelers shocked by France's reality, now applied to anyone whose bucket list was written by a Vegas architect. The irony, these facades often outlast their inspirations. When Venice suffered catastrophic flooding in 2019, its real canals were impassable, while the Venetians' gondolas sailed on, untouched by climate change or decay. What makes Vegas lies so compelling is their honesty about being fabrications. Unlike historical reconstructions that claim authenticity, these cities wink at their own artifice. The Eiffel Tower here has a roller coaster wrapped around it. The Statue of Liberty holds a neon martini glass. The message isn't, "This is Paris," but "Wouldn't you rather vacation in the upgrade?" In a world where reality increasingly disappoints, these architectural mirages offer a seductive alternative. History without the headaches, culture without the crowds, and landmarks that, like the bets placed beneath them, always let you feel like you're winning. From stone to steel, empires have always wielded architecture not just as shelter, but as psychological warfare in 3 dimensions. These 24 deceptions prove something profound. Civilizations rise and fall not just on military might or economic strength, but on their ability to manipulate what people believe is possible. That hollow colossus convinced enemies of untouchable wealth. Those leaning towers and forced perspectives transformed engineering flaws into symbols of divine favor. Even today, when we snap photos of ancient ruins, we're often capturing not the reality of those empires, but the carefully curated illusions they wanted us to inherit. What makes these architectural lies so timeless is how they exploit universal human instincts. We equate size with strength, shine with wealth, and permanence with power. The rulers who understood this didn't just build structures, they built experiences, crafting moments that bypassed logic to speak directly to our awe. Whether through Versailles' endless reflections or the Taj Mahal's engineered infinity, they turned stone and mortar into emotional alchemy, making visitors feel small not just physically but existentially. Modern leaders still play this game, though the materials have changed. Today's glass skyscrapers and LED facades serve the same purpose as gilded Corinthian columns projecting an image of untouchable success. The difference, ancient builders left clues in the cracks and hollow spaces for those who knew where to look. Our task as students of history is to search for those tells in the monuments around us, asking not just "How was this made?" but "What does this want me to feel?" So the next time you stand before some grand architectural marvel, whether it's a 2,000-year-old temple or a brand new corporate headquarters, pause for a moment. Look past the postcard perfection. Search for the seams where reality meets aspiration, because the greatest lesson these 24 lies teach us isn't about ancient engineering tricks. It's about the stories we choose to believe and why those in power work so hard to make us believe them. If you've enjoyed unraveling these centuries-old deceptions with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. And down in the comments, I'd love to hear which architectural illusion surprised you most. Was it the Parthenon's hidden curves, Rome's marble masks, or something else entirely? The conversation about history's greatest cons is just beginning.